Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to my wrap up for November and December. So these are all of the things that I have read over that time, and I am posting this in January because I wanted to make sure I captured the end of my 2019 reading year. So that's why I'm posting it now. But without further ado, let's get into all of the books that I finished at the end of 2019. First up, I read a book called The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, and this is one of the books set in his first lore world, and it followed a character that I didn't really like in the first trilogy, so I wasn't entirely invested in this one. I ended up giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars, mostly because of the fact that I didn't care about some of the characters. I kind of saw this as a little bit of a bridging book with world building and character development to the rest of the characters that I wanted to read about. It does follow Black Dow, and it is 8 years along since the last time we really deep dived into his character, and he is at the moment a war chief and he's leading a war against the Union. So we see characters from Black Dow's side and from the Union side and how the fallout of both end up mixing together. And it really focused on the battle elements. It was a very military-esque book when it came to fantasy, and while I like battles and I like spectacle and I like fight scenes because I find them really, really cool, and if they're done well I can imagine them really well, this one just got so drawn out and there were so many different characters and I just wasn't invested like I wanted to be. That said, Joe Abercrombie writes characters really well, so I could identify each character as they came up in the story because he writes them so nuanced and so intricately that I could identify the differences quite easily between them, but at the same time I didn't really care about their story arc and it seemed a little bit manic. I guess that's what it was supposed to be considering they're in a war and all of the characters feel a bit manic themselves, but I was just like, it wasn't something that I was too fussed to read about. It says here in my notes that I did like the ending a lot more than the actual build up to that, but that's to be expected because there's usually a natural build in a book that leads to an ending, so liking the ending more than the rest of the book is not necessarily a glowing review, but again, I did give it 3 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it enough to continue and I kind of just used this as a stepping stone to get to the next book. Next up, I read Aeon by Ellison Goodman, and this is a young adult fantasy. It's an Asian inspired fantasy and it follows a character named Aeon, and she is masquerading as a boy to get into this League of the Dragon Eye, and they're very revered in society, and the Dragon Eye are basically involved in the magic system in this book, so certain characters can see and interact with the dragon spirits that are present in this world and from that harness their power. So Aeon is trying to harness this power. She also has a master that wants to get back into the Dragon Eye circle, and I thought that this had a mixture of things that I would really, really enjoy, but I found the tension a little bit lacking. It was fairly formal in the way that Aeon interacted with all of the characters, and that's to be expected because it's a very revered society, but at the same time I wanted a little bit more, maybe? I guess I'm just used to reading about characters like in Joe Abercrombie's work that are more roguish and more morally grey and will go after what they want unapologetically, but that really didn't happen in this book and it kind of was different to what I'm usually used to reading, I guess. The writing I think was the fault here when it came to my enjoyment level, because what I just spoke about, the writing was actually very slow and informational, and I think that kind of went hand in hand with the way that I responded to it, so I didn't love it as much as I thought. It kind of gave me mild Memoirs of a Geisha vibes with the initiation that Aeon had to go through, but apart from that, while I loved Memoirs of a Geisha, I didn't connect with this as much as I wanted to. In my notes I said that the ending to this was a little bit convenient, and there was also a really gross predatory scene in here. It was necessary to a villain and it didn't take it too far, but I was like, oh, that's creepy. And if that vibe continued with that particular evil character across the rest of the book, and the tension that we felt in that scene was across the rest of the book, then I probably would have had more of an emotional response to it like I did with that scene. But now talking about it, and it's been more than a month since I read this, that's really the only scene that stands out to me as something that had an impact. So the rest of this is kind of just blurred a little bit into my memory. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it at the time, but I probably wouldn't reread it, and I mean, this is signed to me, so I'm hesitant about getting rid of it, but if it was just a book that wasn't personalized to me, then I would probably have donated it already. Next up, I read another audiobook, and it is called Red Country, also by Joe Abercrombie, and this takes place after the war in The Heroes, and I liked this story a little bit better because it had a little bit more character direction rather than just plot direction and spectacle in the war. It followed a bunch of different characters, but the ones that stand out to me are the character named Shy, and she runs a farm, but you get kind of a feeling that she has been a mercenary of some kind before, and that gave her a real edge, and I really liked that. She was also quite fiery. She was very quick to put someone in their place when they jumped down her throat, which was really cool. I liked seeing her do those kind of things and not just be a placid character that went along with everything. So that was a plus. This really also read as a reunion of characters in Best Served Cold, which I really, really liked. So I would reiterate that you need to read all of these books in order like I did, because otherwise you'll miss certain things. Obviously you won't understand the character development that's got certain characters to where they are in Red Country. So again, just read all of the books up until Red Country and you'll be fine. Even though this book was left with a kind of open-ended potential, I was pretty satisfied by it, to be honest. I enjoyed the book, I enjoyed the story, I enjoyed meeting the characters that we met, and I know that they're going to crop up again in the rest of his books, but I gave Red Country 4 out of 5 stars. I liked it. It had more character detail and depth than the previous book, so again, that's why my rating went up for it. Next up, I read A Tunnel of Bones by Victoria Schwab, and this is a middle grade book. It's the second in her middle grade series, and this follows her main character named Cassidy, and she and her parents with their TV series have gone to Paris for this book. So each book is set in a different country. So the first book, City of Ghosts, was set in Edinburgh, and obviously this is set in Paris at the Tunnel of Bones. And our main character Cassidy can see the dead because she had an experience when she was a little bit younger and she went off a bridge nearby her house, and her friend brought her back across the veil and brought her back into life, but her friend is a ghost. So Cassidy now, because she's had this near-death experience, I don't know what to call it. I say near-death, but technically she died and got brought back. Because of that experience, now she can cross into the veil at will, and she can also see and interact with ghosts. So her parents don't know that she can do this, and they have a ghost TV show where they go to different locations across the globe and kind of chronicle the ghost activity there, because one of her parents does believe in ghosts and the other one doesn't. So you get kind of their commentary and their interaction as well as Cassidy's plot. So Cassidy believes she has uncovered a poltergeist, and she thinks she needs to do something about it because nobody else really can, and she can interact with it. So that's really what A Tunnel of Bones follows. I like in this book that the character Jacob, who is the ghost, was doing a few things every now and then, and stuff like that was sprinkled in the first book. I don't want to go into specifics obviously, but he kept trying things and doing things again in this book, and Cassidy just kept noticing it and then not acknowledging it. But in this book they actually have a sit down conversation together about what Jacob's doing and about Jacob's life and their friendship, and I really liked that it went into that depth. Especially for a book targeted at such a young audience, I think sitting down to have conversations like that is really important. And while I loved that aspect of it, I wasn't as compelled by the plot as I was with book 1. So I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars rather than a full 5 out of 5 like book 1. But that said, I still really, really enjoyed this. So the next book that I read, you guessed it, it is also by Joe Abercrombie, and it is Sharp Ends, and this is a bind-up of novellas by him, and you definitely need prior knowledge. This is technically the 7th book in his first lore world, so you need to know who the characters are before reading this installment, because it follows backstories of a few characters, especially Glockta. That was an interesting one because Glockta in The Blade itself, which is the first book in the first lore, he is severely crippled, and he's also working for the Inquisition, who tend to not treat their prisoners and guests very well. They torture them. So we get to follow him before this happened to him, and we get to see him as a young, arrogant swordsman, and it was interesting to see his personality that way when I'm used to seeing him a different way. Another one to note is Bethod. So we get to see him in this novella, and it's really interesting because this novella actually made me like and respect Bethod, whereas in the trilogy I hated him because he was the main villain. And I love that Joe Abercrombie can do that about a character. He can really position you from their perspective and make you really empathize with them, or at least empathize for what you want to happen with them. And you really saw Bethod's perspective of the Bloody Nine, which is Logan Ninefingers, and how Logan was so manic and evil, and how Bethod had to try and deal with that. Whereas from the first lore series, you really see Logan's side and the other end of what is going on there. So I just love that kind of play on character that Joe Abercrombie wrote, and this installment in the series really built characters up for me, and I really liked it. While we do see snapshots of different characters like Glockta and Bethod and a few others, in between each of those there is an ongoing story that's a progression story between Jazra and Shev. Both of them are thieves, and Jazra seems to be kind of like an Amazonian woman. I'm not sure how to describe her, but she's very, very strong, but she's also very candid and very blunt, and I find her and Shev balance each other quite well, and they're quite funny. So I really enjoyed reading those stories in between all of the characters I already knew, and I really wanted want an actual novel between Chev and Jazra. I think it would be absolutely awesome because I loved seeing them in this novella a lot. And this actually makes sense because now I understand the context of the story that Joe Abercrombie wrote for the Rogues Compendium. So a bunch of fantasy authors contributed to Rogues, and I actually have a spoiler-free review of it. I'll link it wherever I can so that you can go and watch that if you want. It's broken up by different authors and timestamps, so you can skip right ahead to what I'm talking about here. But Rogues actually had a story of Jazra and Chev in it, and it happened more towards the end of their story arc in Sharp Ends, so I didn't really vibe with it as much as I vibe with it now. So I like that I got to see that progression of it, and I would probably bump my rating up to whatever I gave it in Rogues. I don't remember what it was, but I like it a lot more in Sharp Ends, and I ended up giving Sharp Ends a 4 out of 5 stars because Joe Abercrombie talking about his characters and letting you see through their head and also seeing them from someone else's perspective. It was really cunning, and it really gives you such an insight into who they really are, and I don't know, I just really liked that, and I really liked the stories in between the characters that we liked, so thoroughly enjoyed it. And obviously I'm going to continue reading Joe Abercrombie. Next up I have A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin, and this is book number 3 in his Song of Ice and Fire series, and I got like 50 something %. I can't remember exactly the number. I was talking about this very much in a reading vlog, but I ended up DNFing this unfortunately, and I'm so disappointed that I put it down because magic is becoming so much more prolific in this series, and that is what I really missed in the TV show, and I just really wanted to see it built up so much more because John's storyline was so interesting and Bran's storyline had so much depth that could be uncovered, but unfortunately it just really positioned the women in this to be sexual objects, and rape really came through in this story, and sexual objectification. It was so bad. In the second book of Clash of Kings, it wasn't as prolific, it was kind of just sidelined and instead favoured characters' story arcs. In here it was really at the forefront, and it really made me uncomfortable. I talked about it a little bit more in my reading vlog because my thoughts were very much fresher in that vlog than they are now, but that's really the gist of it, and it's unfortunately why I ended up DNFing this series. So you probably won't see the series on my shelf anymore because I really want to get rid of these. So unfortunately, even though these covers are absolutely beautiful, they're the landscape editions, and I really wanted to keep them and enjoy them, I just couldn't really continue, and I'm disappointed that I couldn't continue. But at the same time, the audiobook for this was like 40 something hours long, so if I can free up my time and read some other audiobooks of fantasy that are not quite as long or as long and are more worth my time, then I think I've done myself a favour in the long run. So unfortunately DNF this halfway through and won't be continuing on with A Song of Ice and Fire, so I'm a little bit sad about that. Next, I read another audiobook, and it is Northern Lights. So that is the first book in his Dark Materials, also known as The Golden Compass. I was very confused when looking this book up because I did not know what to call it, but it is by Philip Pullman, and I listened to it on audiobook, and I really enjoyed it on audiobook. I really wish that I had gotten to this series when I was a lot younger because I think I would have really liked it. I think I would have found a lot more joy than I have found reading it as an adult. And that's not to say it's a bad book, but I think if I was younger, I would latch onto it a little bit more, and it would be more nostalgic for me, especially like Narnia and Harry Potter are for me. So I'm sad that I didn't discover it earlier, but I'm happy that I'm reading it now. It follows our main character named Lyra, and she is living in London, but it's kind of like an urban fantasy alternate London. So she's at Oxford. She is living with a bunch of scholars because she doesn't know who her real parents are. And in this world, every person is born with a demon familiar. And when you're a child, that demon familiar is constantly changing. It can change into any kind of creature, and we definitely see that with Lyra's demon. But when you get to a certain age, the demon becomes fixed. Like your identity suddenly becomes fixed, and that's the demon they stay for the rest of your life. And it follows Lyra and her demon, and also these people who are kidnapping children, and one of her friends gets kidnapped, and you kind of see the fallout of her trying to go on a quest to save him. And that is really the thrust of book 1. I really liked it, and I also didn't realize that the audiobook would be so multifaceted because it's got a different voice actor for each character that we hear speak, and then it's got Philip Pullman who is reading the actual narration of the book, and I loved that you got that texture of the book because it was so good. And obviously it was made for kids, so kids could easily distinguish who was talking and when, and as an adult I really enjoyed that as well. And I realized that Rupert Dagus, who is one of the voice actors in this audiobook, actually narrates The Name of the Wind, which is one of my favorite books of all time, so that was just an added bonus. And one of the things that I also really liked about Lyra that I just wanted to add is that even though she's a kid, and obviously adults are supposed to have some kind of authority over her, I really liked how they didn't inhibit her all the time. They didn't just stop her from doing things and make her rebel. She kind of managed to talk her way into and out of and around situations and help people see reason. And she also obviously rebelled against it because she's a mischievous kid. But I liked that the adults weren't just the obstacles. They were actually trying to keep her safe as well. And you could see through Lyra's perspective that she understood that, but she also wanted to rebel against it and do her own thing anyway. And that's what I liked about the series. It had enough responsibility in it that you could go, okay, the adults aren't just there to like bar the plot and make her go in one direction. They're actually there to provide some sort of safety net for her. And I don't see that as much as I want to when I read middle grade or young adult books. Often the adults are either not there at all, so the kids can do whatever they want, or they're there and they just put an entire block there for the character so that the character can't go the way that they want, and they have to actively rebel and fight against that adult who doesn't necessarily seem to have as much logic as the characters in this book did. So I really enjoyed this book. I continued on with the second book, An Amber Spyglass, and I'm really enjoying this series, so I gave the first book in the series 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I had another DNF, and I also talked about this in a reading vlog, and it is Darkblade, and this is more like a middle grade to young adult fantasy. It had fairly young writing. It's about this boy who is found in a barn by this couple, and fast forward 14 or 15 years and this woman is now having a child of her own, but she ends up dying in childbirth, and the father blames this boy for bringing a curse into the family. And I didn't really vibe with the narration of this book. I found it fairly easy to tune out of because I was listening to the audiobook, and I know fantasy on audiobook can sometimes be hard to grasp because there are so many foreign names and things that you're unfamiliar with. Obviously, it's not set in our world, so it's less relatability with the setting, but I listen to so many fantasy books on audio, so I'm really accustomed to tuning into them, and the fact that I couldn't tune into Darkblade just meant that something about the writing wasn't hooking me, unfortunately. So I got like 5% into this book. I know it's not much, but it was a couple of chapters and it was enough for me to decide. So because of that reason, because I didn't connect with the writing style, I ended up DNFing it. So after that DNF, I was sad and I wanted to read something short and something that I knew I would enjoy, and I picked up To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. She has her books up here on this bookshelf because I love her. I read the Wayfarer series and I absolutely adored it. So when it was announced last year that she was coming out with a novella, and it wasn't necessarily related, but it was still Becky Chambers, I was like, I'm going to enjoy this, and sure enough I did. It follows a character named Ariadne, and she is on a deep dive into space with a crew of scientists like her, and they're basically going to new planets to see if there is any forms of life and scientific life that they can build upon. But at the same time, while they're visiting, they're also making sure to be mindful of the impact they're having on these different planets and these different planet environments. And you get to see the effects of their relationships and the long haul into space and the way that they interrogate their own individuality and their own identity when it comes to being stuck somewhere and when it comes to interacting with certain things on this planet, and how Ari, the main character, felt guilty when certain things were introduced or destroyed. And it was just a really interesting analogy, especially when you compare it to climate change in our world now. And I just really, really enjoyed it. While I wasn't enthralled like I was with her Wayfarers series, especially with Record of a Spaceborne Few, I really like that she writes characters with such a softness and such an openness, especially when you want to see that softness and openness appear in everybody that you meet. And there's also an effortless diversity in this book as well, which is across her Wayfarer series too. There is, I believe, they never explicitly say it, so you can read it however you want, but there is a polyamorous character, there's a bisexual character, and I believe there's also an asexual character in here as well. But again, they're not labeled in the actual text, so you can read it however you want to. Even though this is a novella, obviously it's quite short, Becky Chambers brilliantly built enough tension into this that I was really intrigued, and she did it so subtly as well. I had such an enormous response to a tiny piece of dialogue, and that really tells you how well she builds character, that moment had such an effect on me when it was built up in such a short space of time. So I just love Becky Chambers' writing. I think she's incredible. The characters she writes are so beautiful, and the stories she writes are so nuanced and thought-provoking as well. And again, I just really love To Be Taught If Fortunate, and I need to buy it physically because I listened to the audiobook, so I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Starsight by Brandon Sanderson, and I did an entire spoiler vlog, so if you've read this book and you want to discuss spoilers with me, go and head over to that vlog because I'd love to chat with you about it. But this is the second book in a quartet that Brandon is writing. The first book is called Skyward, and it follows Spencer, so I don't want to detail too much about what this is because obviously it's the second book in a series, but the basic premise is that Spencer is living on a planet called Detritus with the last remnants of the human race, and they're being attacked by an alien race called the Krell, and this is a very military-based sci-fi book, so Spencer's people really have to rely on their capacity to fly and defend this planet. And in the first book, you see Spencer really trying to get into flight school and fighting against the fact that her father was deemed a coward because he bailed on his flight when he was a pilot. So that really tarnishes Spencer's image in everyone's eyes on this planet, because being a coward is one of the worst things you can be, because you need to be brave always to defend your planet against the Krell. That really sums up book 1. Book 2 was not necessarily set in a similar environment, but it took Spencer and a few of the characters that we are familiar with in book 1 and put them in a different environment with different things that she responded to. And I don't want to say too much more because obviously it's going to spoil you, but I really want to talk about this book. I talked about it a lot in a spoiler vlog, so I feel like I'm just kind of reiterating stuff but a lot more vaguely in a wrap up. But I liked this book less than Skyward, only by like a star. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars and I gave Skyward 5 out of 5. And I think that's because Skyward really built up Spencer and her character and the world on Detritus. But in this book, it took Spencer out of that and put her somewhere new. And this built up the world building of not the solar system, but the world where Spencer's planet exists in. And I liked that, but I wish that we had more interaction of the characters that were built up in the first book, because I felt that was a little bit missing. At the end of this one, I connected more with the things that were going on in here, with the characters that we meet in here as well. But during the start, I was really pumped because it started where Skyward pretty much left off, but after that it really deviated and I wanted to get involved and get invested, but it kind of threw me a little bit with the change in scenery. So I didn't dislike it, I did enjoy it, but I just wish that I was a bit more rooted in other characters that we've built up before. But I'm sure it'll circle back to those, so I don't need to stress about it too much. But yes, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm going to stop talking about it now. If you have anything to say about Starsight, let me know in the comments or go and chat to me on my spoiler vlog. I'll link it in the description down below. Next up, I listened to, would you believe it, another audiobook, and it is The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman. This is the second book, so it's not The Amber Spyglass, which I said earlier. That is the third book. So this is the second book that I listened to, and I enjoyed it, even though the beginning kind of threw me off a little bit because the book opened and it wasn't on Lyra's character, and I was like, where is she? It opened with a character named Will, and he is in our version of London in Oxford, and you're like, what is going on? So that threw me off a little bit, but Lyra does come into it after a few chapters and those characters meet up. So without spoiling anything further, that's really the basic premise of it. So I don't really have too much to say about this, considering it's the second in a series, and deviating from the first book setting threw me off a little bit, but I got my footing and I really enjoyed it regardless. I liked the character of Will and how he got built up, and I like that both he and Lyra had different forces of the plot that were pulling them in different directions, but how those things all came together at the end were really interesting. And I want to see how things end up going in the third book, which is an Amber Spyglass, because it's been set up so interestingly with Will and Lyra, and obviously now I really want to finish the series and see how it all comes to a head, because there are villains in this. There was a villain that was more present in the first book than the second, and I think that's kind of what drove the first book more so than the second book, because I wanted that character to appear a little bit more than she did, but that's okay. She's probably going to appear in the third book more heavily. So not too much to say on this. I'm pretty sure I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars as well. There are a lot of 4 stars in this wrap up. So I have another 4 stars, and it is Call Down the Hawk by Maggie Stiefvater. I have a review coming for this very, very soon. It's either at the end of this month or the start of February. So look out for that. I will link it when I have it up on my channel so that you are not kind of digging through all of my videos to find it. But it is a spoiler-free review, so you'll be fine watching it. But I read Call Down the Hawk. Let's get back to the point, shall we? I read this book and I really enjoyed it. I'm a convert now because I was worried about reading this book, but then I watched Books and Lala's reading vlog on it, and she also did a spoiler-free reading vlog, so that's what really made me want to pick this up. And then Scholastic kindly sent this to me after I requested it. I don't know how much I can really talk about this without getting into spoiler territory, but it's technically the 5th book in a already established world, so if you read her Raven Cycle series, I would recommend doing that first before you jump into this one, because it details characters and where they are and what they're up to, and it also follows one of the main characters in the quartet in this book. So we follow Ronan in here, but we also follow a couple of other perspectives as well. So it's not just Ronan, it's Ronan and his brothers Matthew and Declan, and then it's also a character that's kind of linked to the magic system with dreaming, and her name is Jordan. And then there's also another character called Carmen, and she is linked with an organization that hunt down dreams and dreamers. So take that as you will. I can't really tell you much more than that, except Ronan is also involved in dreaming, which is why the book that focuses on him in the initial quartet is called The Dream Thieves. So go and read the quartet first and then come here, and this really delves more into the magic system, but the magic system is really characterized through characters' eyes, so you don't see it as hard and fast rules, you kind of see it through their experiences and how they decide to categorize things. So it's a hard magic system to grasp because it doesn't have distinct rules, but there are also rules that characters make for themselves as to what to do and what not to do. So you can kind of see how the magic works with how they experience it, is what I'm trying to get at. I liked the magic in here. Like I said, I liked Ronan's character, although he did go through his distinct character arc in the first quartet, so he didn't go through an entire character development story in here, but he did have a story arc. So you saw him interact, but you didn't necessarily see him grow as much as he grew in the Raven Cycle. I ended up liking it. Again, like I said, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I'm eager to continue because this is going to be a trilogy, and I really like Maggie's writing style, even though I know it's not for everyone. It's fairly lyrical, it's fairly whimsical, and it doesn't nail things down in specifics. So if you don't like a book like that, you might not like this because you'll either get bored or confused, but I really enjoyed it and I'm looking forward to continuing. I would recommend the audiobook for this as well because it was thoroughly enjoyable. Next up, I read a manga called A Silent Voice, and this is volume 1, and I believe there are a bunch of volumes, so I'm only just starting this series, but there's also a movie adaptation of this as well, and I think it's fairly true to the actual manga because I've seen that movie a couple of years ago, and what it was detailing in the movie was very, very specific to what was in the first volume of this manga. So we follow a guy who is a bully who's on the front cover, and then a girl who is either deaf or hearing impaired, it's not really specified, and she starts at his school when they're in middle school, and because she's different and because this character is really, really bored, and the class kind of gets on board with this and it gets really nasty, but when he gets called on the fact that he's bullying her, the class goes, oh yeah, you're a terrible person for bullying her because you drove this entire thing. They end up turning kind of on him, so it's about him getting bullied by the class as well. It's about this girl who ends up transferring schools, trying to interact with him but not really being successful, and then at the end of the first volume they run into each other as seniors at high school, and they have all of this history that was really kind of left unresolved, so you don't know what's going to happen next. So this is a very contemporary manga. It doesn't involve any fantastical elements whatsoever, so you could probably read this for like a contemporary-a-thon or contemporary readathon or something. It is really accessible for people who probably haven't read manga before and want to start because, again, it doesn't involve anything that's too fantastical. It's pretty easy to follow, and it's got a deep sense of tension and drama as well, and it's also got a very serious tone when it comes to bullying and the fallout of that kind of thing, and I really like that it had that serious nature to it, and that's probably why I'm going to continue, because I like that the character realized his mistakes, and I like that he wants to address them with the character that copped some of his bullying. I really liked this volume. I'm really looking forward to continuing on with it. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Really, really enjoyed it, and I'm probably going to rewatch the movie after I finish reading all of the manga. And then the last book that I ended up reading in 2019 is Supernova by Marissa Meyer, and this is the 3rd book in her Renegades series. So the first book is Renegades, the second is Arch Enemies, which I read in January of last year, and then I finished this one in December. So this is my last read, like I said, of 2019, and I'm really, really proud that I finished the series. I gave this the same rating as I gave Arch Enemies, and I think I liked Renegades more than this book. If you don't know the premise to this, I don't want to tell you what the premise to the 3rd book is, obviously because of spoilers, but the premise to the first book, Renegades, is that we follow Nova McLean, and she is an anarchist who is a villain in this world. We're kind of in a regressed America, and superheroes are really the thrust of politics and political power, and they pretty much run things, and they also save people, as heroes should, but they don't necessarily save everyone. And unfortunately, Nova copped this because when she was really young, her family was murdered, and the Renegades, even though she called them, they did not come, and now she wants to get revenge over them. So she kind of infiltrates the Renegades, pretends to be one of them, and then the trilogy follows her leading this double life as a agent slash spy for the anarchists while she's masquerading as a renegade, but she gets to see both parties and realizes that she kind of identifies with both. And it's just a really interesting foray into understanding morality and what would you do if you're in this kind of situation. But I found that the reason I didn't love Supernova is because she took so long to solidify her decision, and I thought her decision would be made at the beginning of this book, and she kept going back and forth even though she kept witnessing these terrible things. And that's what really was the crux of my frustration with this book. I just wanted her to be consistent, but she kept kind of flip-flopping because the plot demanded that she do so, even though Nova was like that within the plot, and that's what frustrated me. At the beginning, the plot did something that surprised me, and it was the fact that I thought Nova's secret identity, because you're pretty sure it's going to be revealed in this book, so I thought that was going to be the whole thrust of this book as well, like it was in Arch Enemies, but no. Actually, in the first story arc, that is addressed, and that actually gave it room to grow from that point onwards into something different, and I really like that it did that. It didn't draw it out for the entire last book. So I gave this 3 out of 5 stars, mostly because I didn't like Nova's inconsistency, but I did like the subplot of the romantic interest between her and Adrian. I like that it made those characters deep dive into themselves and try and figure out who they were and fight for each other and fight for themselves. And I like the superpowers in here as well. I think they're all very unique and very interesting. Unfortunately, I wanted it to be pulled off a little bit better. I did enjoy the ending, but the lead up to it was a little bit hot and cold for me. I obviously ended up finishing it. I liked it, but it wasn't something that was amazing. But I'm glad that I finished the series, so I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. So now, because I have come to the last wrap up of my 2019 reading year, and I know I'm posting this in January, but I want to talk about kind of my stats anyway. So I ended up reading 74 books in 2019, which I'm really proud of. Actually, I initially wanted to read 100, but that's okay. I just didn't reach it. I modify my Goodreads goal so it doesn't stress me out. So I'm just glad that I got to 74, and I also had an unread pile at the start of January 2019, and that was at 150 unread books, which is quite a lot. But throughout unhauls and throughout reading, obviously, I got that right down to underneath 60 books. And then with a book haul, obviously, that I posted recently, it has gone back up again. So I've got about 63 books that are unread that are on my pile to read, and I'm just really proud that I got it way under 100. So my goal for this year is to get it as low as possible. So I'm hoping to get it to like 30, but we'll see how I go. And then when it comes to pages read, I have read 31,272 pages in 2019, and the shortest book that I read is The Test by Sylvain Neuvel, and then the longest book that I read is The Burning White by Brent Weeks. This was 106 pages. This was 992 pages. My average rating of 2019 is actually 3.9 stars according to Goodreads. And then lastly, the last thing that I want to add to this kind of stats wrap up is that I read books that are 422 pages on average long, which is a little bit surprising because I read a lot of adult fantasy and that tends to be at least 500 pages, if not more. So I'm a little bit surprised by that number, but I did read a bunch of manga graphic novels and also young adult books, which tend to be a little bit shorter, so I guess that number kind of makes sense in retrospect. These plus audiobooks are all of the books that I read in November and December, so thank you so much for watching this video. If you have read any of these, please chat to me in the comments. I would love to hear what your ratings are as well, but for now I will catch you in my next video, so thank you so much for watching. Bye.